Tonight, we drift into the shallow waters of the northern Adriatic, where reeds whisper over mud flats and moonlit tides slide through quiet channels. Here, in the uneasy years after Roman rule faded, frightened families search for safety among the islands. Settle in now, get comfortable, and let the weight of the day loosen as we begin this gentle journey toward the first stirrings of Venice. Told History shares calm, true stories from the past, spoken slowly to help you rest while forgotten worlds return for a little while. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, please like and subscribe to support the channel. And now, with the mainland dim behind us and the lagoon opening ahead, let us move softly into the waters where refuge became the beginning of a city. Chapter 1. Due to P. W. The Lagoon of Refuge. In the 5th century, the old order of Roman authority in northern Italy weakened and the land beyond the coast grew uncertain. Across towns and fields, people faced disruption, raids and sudden change. The lagoon, once a marginal place of fishermen, salt workers and narrow islands, began to seem less like a wilderness and more like a patient shelter shaped by water. The Venetian lagoon did not offer comfort in any grand sense. It was wet, unstable and always changing. Sandbars shifted, mud banks appeared and vanished with the tide. Channels curled through reeds and shallow pools under a broad sky. Yet this difficult place had one precious advantage. Dadaio, that thing. It was hard for armies to cross. What looked inhospitable to conquerors could look merciful to families carrying children, tools and memory. In the decades after the Western Roman Empire came to its formal end in 476, northern Italy passed through a repeated strain. New rulers rose, alliances changed, and violence could move suddenly across the mainland. Later, in the 6th century, the Lombard invasion deepened the sense of danger in the region. For many communities near the coast, the lagoon became part refuge, part frontier, and part uncertain promise. Those who came into the lagoon did not arrive at once as founders of a future republic. They came more simply as people in search of safety. Some were likely from nearby Roman towns such as Altinum, Oderzo and Aquileia, moving gradually into more protected spaces. They brought habits of trade, devotion and local identity with them, even as the ground beneath their feet turned from road and field to marsh and water. Imagine the first approach at dawn. Flat light spreads over still water. Birds rise from the reeds. The air tastes faintly of salt and wet earth. Small boats slide through narrow channels where the bottom can almost be seen beneath the surface. Ahead, low islands rest only a little above the tide. There are no marble palaces here, no bell towers yet. Bit, tall, ashnally. Only the quiet possibility that survival might take root. Life in such a place demanded patience rather than conquest. The settlers learned the moods of the lagoon as carefully as one learns a difficult language. They watched where the current cut deep channels and where it left soft ground. They noted which island stayed firmest during storms. They came to understand that building here meant cooperation with water, not victory over it, because the tide always returned to remind them who shaped the land. Early dwellings were humble, likely made of timber, reeds and other materials close at hand. Wood could be driven into the muddy ground as piles, creating platforms strong enough for simple structures. Roofs sheltered families from wind and rain, while walls kept out only part of the damp. Nothing about these first homes suggested magnificence. Their greatness lay in their persistence. Dedalpol. Each one said that people intended to remain. Freshwater was never abundant, and every necessity had to be managed with care. Food came from fishing, from shellfish gathered in the shallows, from trade, and from what could be brought from safer patches of land. Salt production also mattered in the lagoon world, linking survival to exchange. Even in these early years, the people of the islands were not isolated dreamers, .de and .mel. They were practical, connected, and alert. To live among mudflats is to accept a different rhythm of time. On the mainland, roads are just firmness and direction. In the lagoon, movement depends on tide, weather, and memory of channels. Travel happens by boat, with poles, oars, and local knowledge. Distances feel softer there. The world is measured in crossings, not miles. This watery habit of life would slowly shape a society that thought in maritime terms almost without noticing. There were older communities in parts of the lagoon before the great movements of refugees, and the new arrivals entered a landscape already known to fishermen and workers. This matters because Venice did not spring from emptiness. It grew from a meeting between vulnerable newcomers and long familiar waters. Settlement was gradual, layered and practical. The story begins not with a single founding moment, but with many quiet decisions to stay another season. Imperial structures weakened, church communities helped preserve continuity. Bishops, clergy and sacred objects could carry a sense of order even when political control faltered. In the lagoon settlements, faith offered more than ritual. It offered memory, belonging, and reassurance that life had not dissolved completely into fear. Small churches and chapels would become anchors of community, rising from uncertain ground as signs that the islands were more than temporary hiding places. Across the water, the mainland still mattered deeply. Families had not forgotten the towns they left behind, nor the Roman world whose institutions had shaped everyday life for centuries. The lagoon was not yet a separate destiny in anyone's imagination. It was a refuge, a place to endure until conditions improved. Yet history often grows in unintended ways. Depuis Porcino, T. Adriani. The spaces people enter for shelter can become the worlds they learn to call home. Natural barriers of the lagoon offered a strange kind of protection. Larger forces could dominate roads, bridges and open country, but channels and marshes interrupted easy movement. Outsiders unfamiliar with the tides risked grounding their boats or losing direction among twisting waterways. Defence here was woven into geography itself. Reeds, shallows and hidden passages became silent allies, creating a landscape where local knowledge mattered more than raw military strength. Listen for a moment to the sounds that might have filled those early evenings. Water taps softly against timber posts. Wind brushes the reed beds. Somewhere, a small craft knocks gently against a landing place. Voices stay low after sunset. Cooking fires fade. The dark over the lagoon feels wide and open, with stars above and black water below. In that stillness, fragile communities rest, uncertain of tomorrow but safe for one more night. Over time, separate island communities began to form clearer patterns of cooperation. Necessity encouraged shared effort in transport, defence and local trade. No single island could thrive entirely alone in a place so dependent on movement and exchange. This tendency toward collaboration would become one of the lagoon's lasting habits. The environment itself taught interdependence. Duelf. Debuhak. Channels linked people together, just as surely as walls and roads linked communities elsewhere. The Byzantine Empire also remained part of this story, especially in the eastern and coastal regions of Italy after Justinian's campaigns in the 6th century. For lagoon communities, imperial connection could still offer legitimacy and administrative ties even from far away. This meant the early world of Venice stood between influences. Dublin, doubt, Roman memory, Byzantine authority and local adaptation. Its identity formed slowly in that meeting point of continuity and change. It is tempting to imagine destiny in every piling driven into the mud, as if the future city were already visible beneath the marsh. But the people living there could not see St. Mark's Basilica, merchant fleets, or the pageantry of later centuries. They saw weather, labour and immediate need. That humility is important. Venice began not as a dream of greatness, but as a sequence of practical answers to instability. Even so, certain advantages were quietly gathering. The lagoon sat near routes that connected inland Italy with the Adriatic Sea. People accustomed to transport by water could carry goods, messages and skills between sheltered islands and wider markets. Survival encouraged flexibility, and flexibility encouraged trade. Little by little, the habits formed in refuge. Dashurel. Duct. Navigation, exchange, communal effort and resilience. D. Deshrach. Picture the settlement now not as a city, but as a necklace of low-inhabited places, each shaped by timber, rope, boats, storage, and prayer. Children grow up knowing tides as naturally as seasons. Adults mend nets, reinforce walkways, and watch the sky for changing weather. The lagoon is never still for long, yet its changes become familiar. A difficult environment slowly turns intimate through repetition, work, and shared endurance. Stories from later centuries often sought a clean origin for Venice, a moment of foundation grand enough for legend. Historians, however, see a slower emergence spread across generations. That quieter truth suits this place. A city born from water would not arrive like a trumpet call. It would gather itself in whispers. Delusion. In moored boats, in mud under wooden posts, in island chapels, and in households deciding not to leave. So the lagoon held them. It held the anxious, the resourceful, the grieving, and the determined. It held memories of Roman life and made room for something new. Beneath open skies and among shifting channels, people learned that refuge could become community. Community, in time, could become identity. An identity, if patiently sustained, could become history. All of that still rests quietly within these first fragile shelters above the tide. This opening chapter comes to rest. The water remains around us. Calm, reflective, and full of beginnings too small for distant chroniclers to notice. Yet here, among reeds and wooden dwellings, the earliest shape of Venice is forming with remarkable patience. In the next part of our journey, these scattered places will draw closer into a more defined world, as refuge slowly turns toward order, leadership, and a life directed by the sea. Chapter 2. Stir. Dinoi, islands bound by water. Mid-Lease, Talvin. In the quiet centuries after the first refugees reached the lagoon, life did not gather in one place all at once. It settled lightly across many islands, each shaped by mud flats, reeds, and shifting channels. Communities formed, where ground stood a little higher, where boats could land, and where families could work with the waters around them. But Chapter 2. Doubles. Duty toll. Islands bound by water. Deramage. Among the earliest and most important of these settlements was Torcello, which rose in the northern lagoon as a place of safety and exchange. Its position gave access to fishing grounds and sheltered routes inland. Over time, people built homes, storehouses, and churches there, not as signs of sudden wealth, but as evidence of steady labour. Both. Chapter 2. Lashro. Dadig. Islands bound by water. Teeple casing. Dutton. Farther south, Malamocco became another centre of lagoon life. It stood closer to routes leading out toward the Adriatic, and this made it valuable for travel and communication. Here, as elsewhere, survival depended on understanding tides, winds, and channels with unusual care. The people of the lagoon were not simply hiding from danger anymore. Tatia. D. Elfalso. Chapter 2. W. Tokolar. Islands bound by water. Board 2. Beelish and Courting. Rialto, which would later become the best known of these island communities, began as one settlement among several. Its name, linked to higher ground, hints at one of the great practical concerns of lagoon life. A little more stability underfoot meant safer building, drier storage, and firmer routines. In a landscape where land and water constantly negotiated. Chapter 2. Ija. Dupalai. Islands bound by water. Home. Ass. No single island could provide everything needed for life. That was one reason the lagoon developed not as a solitary town, but as a network. Salt might come from one area, fish from another, timber from the mainland beyond, and skilled labour from many hands moving back and forth. The water between settlements was not empty distance. Dude. Timor. Chapter 2. Dak. Pan. Islands bound by water. Tapus. Dowall. Deadly Iancord Idihazd. Salt was among the lagoon's most valuable resources. In shallow basins, seawater could be guided, held, and slowly evaporated, leaving behind the mineral that preserved food and carried great value in trade. Salt mattered because it extended life beyond the moment of harvest or catch. It meant fish could be stored, exchanged, and transported. In these quiet fields of sun and Chapter 2, It Ti Doel. Taste good. Islands bound by water. Me. Dan. Fish too sustained the early communities in direct and constant ways. The lagoon offered eels, shellfish and many other species that could be caught with local knowledge refined across generations. Fishing required attention to currents, seasons and habits of the water itself. Meals, markets and routines all depended on this intimate awareness. In the gentle movement of nets and small boats, daily survival became a practice. Chapter 2. That right equation. Ter. Islands bound by water. Timber did not grow in abundance on the mud islands themselves, yet wood was essential for nearly everything. It was needed for houses, for walkways over damp ground, for boats, and for the piles driven deep to support heavier buildings. Much of this material came from the mainland and nearby uplands. Bringing it in required planning and trust. Dopplich. Chapter 2. But, Dote, islands bound by water. Dillemeshtawe. That. Boat travel was not a special activity reserved for merchants or officials. It was ordinary life. To visit another settlement, carry goods, tend fisheries, or reach the mainland, one usually went by water. Children would have grown up with the sight and sound of hulls against docks, poles dipping into shallows, and voices crossing channels. Movement across the lagoon taught people where they belonged. Chapter 2. Dasher. Doubt of. Islands bound by water. The Itus Aamar. Dot enter that touch. Because the lagoon was difficult for outsiders to master, local knowledge became a kind of wealth. To know which channels stayed deep, which mudbanks shifted, and when storms could trap a vessel was to hold something precious. These were practical skills, yet they also shaped identity. The people of the lagoon were becoming a community not only through trade and labour, but through shared experience of a difficult. Chapter 2. Tial. Beacher. Islands bound by water. Duash. Ye. The early settlements remained connected to the wider world of the former Roman provinces, and, later, to the authority of the Byzantine Empire. Yet daily life in the lagoon encouraged habits of local cooperation. Decisions had to answer immediate needs. Diktatswarfin. Dafulace a keep. Repairing landing places, distributing resources, managing transport, and responding to danger. Chapter 2. Defricolization. Islands bound by water. Holding. Durkino. Churches helped anchor these communities, giving spiritual structure to places that were otherwise exposed to weather and change. A church was more than a building for prayer. It could gather a neighbourhood, mark continuity, and offer a sense of permanence where the landscape itself seemed uncertain. Bells, processions and feast days would have drawn scattered households into shared rhythms. Chapter 2. Dotolax. The Age. Islands bound by water. Chwentpard. Torcello, in particular, became known as an important early centre, and its later cathedral still hints at that significance. Historians see in such places the growth of a more settled lagoon society, one capable of supporting religious institutions, craft activity and exchange. Yet even here, grandeur came slowly. Before monuments, there were marsh edges, workboats and practice. Chapter 2. Dashenportingra and Fipo. Islands bound by water. Dutholb. To Bikipo, Malamocco also held political importance in the earlier phases of Venetian history, before the centre of power shifted more firmly toward Rialto. This movement was not dramatic in the way legends often prefer. It reflected changing needs, strategic choices, and the uneven advantages of geography. Some locations offered better shelter, stronger routes, or more reliable ground. Chapter 2. Doppels, Confils like Sotros, Dupley Day. Islands bound by water. As these settlements matured, people likely felt loyalty first to family, parish and island. But over time, another feeling began to grow. The Eiththeon, Bekandor, that they belonged to a wider lagoon community. Shared trade, shared risks, and shared dependence on water encouraged this broader sense of connection. Identity formed. Chapter 2. Kinda feels like Sotwe, Dutia. Islands bound by water. Dashnia. Balsam. Civic life in early Venice did not emerge from marble halls rising suddenly above the sea. It began in practical assemblies, negotiations and compromises shaped by local conditions. People needed ways to settle disputes, coordinate labour and maintain the fragile balance between islands. Leadership had to be useful before it could become ceremonial. In that sense, government. Chapter 2. Sampenlationals. Tese. Islands bound by water. Dode. D.D.A. shore. The lagoon also encouraged a certain patience. Building here was slow. Foundations demanded effort. Transport took time. Weather could interrupt plans without warning. Nothing could be forced quickly against water, mud and tide. This slowness became part of the character of the place. Venice was not carved from solid earth in a single grand design. Assured. Double. Chapter 2. Doppel. Islands bound by water. Borch. De Effig. Trade within the lagoon prepared its people for wider exchange beyond it. When communities learned to move salt, fish, timber, tools and food between islands, they also developed habits useful for larger commerce. Weight, timing, storage and trust all mattered. Markets depend on confidence as much as goods. In these modest beginnings, the future merchant culture too. Dash Utigans. Dayujidin. Islands bound by water. D.S. Out. The mainland remained close, and the lagoon communities were never entirely separate from it. They drew supplies, people, and influence from inland regions while preserving a distinctive way of life shaped by water. This balance was delicate. The islands needed connections beyond themselves, yet they also learned to guard their particular autonomy. Their strength would come from standing between worlds. Chapter 2. E.T. Ast. Doubly Smaveral Lake. Islands bound by water. Baxtu Shiash. Doppel. Even the simplest acts could carry civic meaning. Repairing a key, sharing a channel, tending salt pans, or coordinating the movement of timber all required cooperation. In such tasks, common interests became visible. A settlement survives when people recognise that their own well-being depends on the care of shared systems. The lagoon taught this. Chapter 2. Tik. Islands bound by water. Tentu. Notation. Over generations, stories would gather around these islands, giving their difficult beginnings a sense of destiny. But for those living through the early centuries, the experience was likely more ordinary and more demanding. There were boats to mend, catches to salt, buildings to shore up, and routes to judge by weather and light. The future glory of Venice was not yet visible. What existed instead was persistence. Sastra. Chapter 2. Dupsash. Thou rollers. Islands bound by water. That we echo. But that's this important for Harvey. It is helpful to imagine the lagoon not as a blank stage awaiting a city, but as an active partner in shaping one. Water limited where people could build, yet it also protected them. Mud complicated construction, yet it encouraged ingenuity. Distance separated islands, yet boats transformed that separation into movement. The environment offered no easy. Chapter 2. Ben. Back. Islands bound by water. Diet. Dotty N. By the time Rialto grew in importance, the groundwork had already been laid by generations living across the lagoon network. Skills, routes, resources and habits of cooperation had accumulated patiently. What later visitors admired as Venetian uniqueness did not spring from a single decision or founder. It developed through many small adjustments to an unusual world. The city to come was Chapter 2. That Dote. To 80. Islands bound by water. Passion calls. Date pulse. So this second chapter of Venice is not a tale of sudden splendour, but of careful assembly. Across Torcello, Malamocco, Rialto and other settlements, people learned how to live with tides instead of against them. Salt, fish, timber and boat travel became the quiet threads of a shared existence. From those repeated patterns of labour and exchange, a civic identity. Chapter 3. Double this. The Rising Republic. Dauti. De Blachas. Venice no longer feels like a fragile refuge of reeds and mudflats. By the 9th century, the lagoon has begun to shape a more confident people, patient and watchful, living between water and sky. Small islands are tied together by custom, labour and necessity. Out of shifting channels and salt air, a republic starts to gather its strength. The altar. Diet Datrawa. Chapter 3. Diet Eng. The Hut 2. The Rising Republic. Noting Harfrall. Duppycollar Road. At the centre of this growing community stands the Doge, the chief magistrate of Venice. The title comes from the Latin dux, meaning leader, and it reflects older ties to the Byzantine world. In early centuries, the Doge held great authority, though never entirely alone. Around him, families, clergy and local interests pressed close, shaping decisions and remarks. Chapter 3. 2T8. The Rising Republic. Tel Abel, the Awidotl. The Doge was both a ruler and a symbol. He represented continuity in a world that could still feel uncertain, where mainland powers shifted and distant emperors claimed loyalty. Yet Venice was learning to protect its own habits of government. Even in these early years, authority depended on consent, negotiation, and practical judgment. This careful balance would become one of the Republic's defining strengths. Chapter 3. Dole, Dutze Eka, the Rising Republic. To Ash, Dashmort the. During the 8th and 9th centuries, political life gradually settled around Rialto, a group of islands near deeper and more useful channels. The move was not sudden theatre, but a practical response to geography. Rialto offered safer anchorage, easier communication, and room for markets to grow. Here, amid wooden walkways and waterside activity, Venice found a more stable heart. Chapter 3. Bell. Apt. The Rising Republic. Dao. But. Wlitz. Rialto mattered because it brought people together. Traders, boatmen, craftsmen, officials and clergy could meet where channels converged and goods changed hands. Salt, fish, timber, grain and imported wares passed through spaces that were still modest, yet increasingly busy. What later generations would know as a famous commercial centre began in these practical gatherings. Chapter 3. Dao Ausing. Daipol Daihestra. The Rising Republic. Ben. Du. The lagoon itself remained Venice's greatest ally. To outsiders, its shallow waters could seem confusing and inhospitable. Mudbanks shifted, channels twisted, and safe passage required knowledge carried in memory and practice. For those who belonged there, however, this watery maze offered protection. Large hostile forces could not easily advance across it. Geography became a Chapter 3. Bikels. The Rising Republic. Daksha. Daisha. Yet the same waters that defended Venice also opened it to the wider world. The Adriatic was not a barrier, but a road. Boats could slip south toward Byzantine territories, east toward the coasts of Dalmatia, and onward into the larger circuits of Mediterranean trade. This was the miracle of the lagoon. Taiskid. Taipolar. Safety without isolation. Venice. Chapter 3. Jubilate Dutonix. T. The Rising Republic. The Ace. The. Venice's relationship with the Byzantine Empire remained important through these early centuries. Formal ties, titles and traditions reflected a long connection to the Eastern Roman world, but distance created room for independence. As imperial strength varied, Venice often acted with increasing freedom, especially in matters of local defence and trade. The Republic was not yet fully detached in spirit. Chapter 3. Diwas. But. The Rising Republic. Alban. In the 9th century, Venice also faced danger from the sea. Raiders and rival powers moved through the Adriatic, testing vulnerable coasts and settlements. These threats encouraged the lagoon community to think more clearly about ships, patrols, and collective defence. Maritime skill was no longer only useful for fishing or trade, it became political strength. The ability to move quickly over water helped Venice. To 3. D8. Dupligay/Raisel. The Rising Republic. Doppeli. One landmark event came in 828 when the relics of St. Mark were brought to Venice from Alexandria. According to Venetian tradition, their arrival gave the city a powerful sacred symbol and helped distinguish it from older mainland centres. St. Mark would become closely linked to Venetian identity, appearing in ceremony, memory and public imagination. Religion and politics met here gently. Chapter 3. Dotikan. Durf. The Rising Republic. No Rampikabhul. Daktrig. The building of the first church of St. Mark beside the ducal seat strengthened that connection between devotion and government. It suggested that Venice was more than a temporary shelter in the marshes. It was becoming a city with its own sacred centre and its own story about legitimacy. Such symbols mattered deeply in the medieval world. They reassured inhabitants, impressed visitors, and placed the Chapter 3. Bixi Tol. WLR. The Rising Republic. Das. Anashi. Dingaspeng. As the 9th century gave way to the 10th, Venice's influence along the Adriatic became harder to ignore. Its sailors knew the coasts, its merchants knew the harbours, and its leaders understood the value of strategic presence. Control was never absolute or simple, But Venetian activity grew more regular and more visible. The Republic began to act not only as a protected settlement. Chapter 3. Ancient Venice, the Rising Republic. Detaching AS. Trade lay behind much of this expansion. Venice occupied a fortunate position between the Italian mainland, the Byzantine East, and the routes that linked northern Europe to Mediterranean markets. Goods could be gathered, exchanged, and carried onward with increasing efficiency. Prosperity came not from conquering vast lands, but from connecting different worlds. The Republic's wealth rose from movement itself. Chapter 3. Ted. Chiicha. The Rising Republic. Tastes good. Diplomacy grew alongside trade. Venetian leaders learned to negotiate with stronger neighbours rather than challenge them recklessly. Agreements with emperors, kings, and regional powers could secure privileges, reduce danger, and preserve autonomy. This patient style suited the lagoon. Venice survived by reading circumstances carefully and choosing flexibility over pride. The sea trained such habit. Chapter 3. Decatonamati. The Rising Republic. That, too. Daily life also reflected this maritime character. Boats were as essential as streets, and the boundary between household labour and commercial activity could be thin. Families lived with the rhythms of tide, weather, repair, loading, and departure. Even those far from formal power participated in the larger transformation. The Republic was not built only by rulers and envoys. It was built by Chapter 3. Dashine 2's Dapushinchi. The Rising Republic. Dawn. Itoj. Wood, rope, sailcloth, and skilled hands all mattered in this environment. A boat was never just a vessel. It was livelihood, protection, and connection. Shipbuilding knowledge accumulated over generations, shaped by practical needs of shallow waters and coastal travel. Venice's future greatness at sea did not appear suddenly. It rested on countless. Chapter 3. Datus. Takes. The Rising Republic. Ant. A half. The lagoon encouraged cooperation because survival often depended on shared effort. Channels had to be known, embankments tended, boats managed, and disputes settled before they could threaten the fragile balance of community life. This did not make Venice free of rivalry. Ambition and competition were always present, but the environment itself favoured institutions that could coordinate many interests. Chapter 3. The Rising Republic. True to outraminter. That's your pizzles. These early institutions were still evolving, and later Venice would surround the Doge with more complex councils and checks on personal power. In the 9th and 10th centuries, however, the important story is the gradual shaping of a political culture. Venice was discovering how to preserve continuity while limiting disorder. It did so without severing itself from tradition. In Chapter 3, Diash. Down. The Rising Republic. Venice's rising reputation did not come from grandeur alone. Visitors and rivals noticed reliability. Ships arrived, markets functioned, and leadership endured despite outside pressure. In a fragmented age, this kind of steadiness could be more impressive than spectacle. The Republic offered a secure point within an unsettled region. Its harbours and channels promised contact, supplies, and negotiation. Chapter 3. Thalana 2. The Era Usei Trav. The Rising Republic. Bell. Ports. By the 10th century, Venice had become a place that connected worlds. It belonged to the Latin West, yet kept deep ties with the Greek East. It was rooted in northern Italy, yet oriented toward the sea. This layered identity gave the Republic unusual advantages. Venetian merchants and diplomats could move between cultures with growing confidence. The city's location did more than shape it. Chapter 3. Tastes good. To be for really. The Rising Republic. Debito. Taipoli mining poli. To imagine Venice at this stage is to picture a city still humble in materials, yet ambitious in function. Timber structures, quays, workshops, churches, and landing places stood above restless water. Bells marked time above the sounds of oars and trade. Nothing about it was accidental. Every built space answered the conditions of the lagoon. In this way, Geography. Chapter 3. Dolly. Debiate. The Rising Republic. Cash awan fiat stachmi. The sea taught Venice patience. Storms delayed departures, tides altered plans, and distant relations required tact rather than haste. These lessons entered the city's character. Venice advanced not through sudden leaps, but through steady accumulation. Chat 2. Of experience, alliances, privileges, roots and confidence. By accepting Chapter 3. FD8. XR. The Rising Republic. Dote. Teat. In these centuries, the foundations of later Venice became visible. The Doge embodied continuity, Rialto gathered commerce, St. Mark's strengthened identity, and the lagoon offered both defence and access. None of these elements stood alone. Together they formed a system, delicate yet resilient, that allowed the Republic to rise without abandoning caution. Venice learned that power could rest on balance. Chapter 3. Das Narration. Dipet Libial. The Rising Republic. Zodi A and T. So the city settles into the 9th and 10th centuries with a clearer sense of itself. It is no longer simply surviving among marsh islands. It is organising, negotiating, trading, worshipping, and watching the sea with growing assurance. The Republic has not reached its later splendour, but its direction is now unmistakable. From protected shallows and busy channels. Chapter 4. Die Wilde. Das Retuki. Arsenals, oars and merchant sails. Tehik. Heitho. By the time Venice had grown into a confident republic, the sea was no distant border but a daily companion. Salt wind moved through markets and narrow canals, and the sound of hammers carried over the water. Here, power did not rest only in palaces or councils. It also lived in shipyards, storehouses, and in the practised hands of workers who understood timber. Chapter 4. Tote. Dote. Arsenals, oars, and merchant sails. Barge. Bial. Venice depended on ships as other cities depended on roads. Across the lagoon, boats carried grain, stone, wool, spices, and news. Beyond the lagoon, larger vessels linked the Republic to the Adriatic, to the Eastern Mediterranean, and to ports where Venetian merchants bargained in many tongues. The city survived because movement never truly ceased, even in quiet hours. Chapter 4. To Buck. Arsenals, oars, and merchant sails. 2. To Dashen. At the centre of this maritime world stood the arsenal, the great state shipyard that became one of Venice's most important institutions. Its earliest documented expansion belongs to the early 12th century, though organised naval construction had older roots. Behind guarded walls, work followed rules, rhythms, and official oversight. Timber arrived, tools rang, and specialised labour. Chapter 4. Thoughts Tay. Arsenals, oars, and merchant sails. WT 800 Duenturus. The arsenal was not simply a place where ships appeared. It was a carefully ordered system. Carpenters shaped frames, caulkers sealed seams, rope makers twisted strong lengths from hemp, and smiths forged nails, fittings, and anchors. Pitch, resin, and canvas had their own importance. Venetian strength emerged from coordination. Chapter 4. To take. Tetsurcharing. Arsenals, oars, and merchant sails. Outer. Dupius Loci. The workers of this world were known for skill rather than ceremony. They understood which timbers bent well, which remained strong under strain, and how to fit one curved piece against another. Oak, larch, and other woods from mainland territories and alpine regions became ribs, planks, masts, and oars. Before a vessel reached open water, it had already passed. Chapter 4. Dashen Eternashen. Tur. Arsenals, oars, and merchant sails. Downed. Okay. Venice guarded access to useful timber with care because ships consumed wood in great quantity. Forests on the mainland mattered to the Republic almost as much as distant harbours. Logs had to be selected, cut, seasoned, transported, and stored. The process was slow, deliberate, and expensive. In this way, every voyage began far from the sea. Chapter 4. Asserman Bastupol Knoll. Timer. Arsenals, oars, and merchant sails. Tudderfield's Soki. Chanpi. Rope was another quiet necessity. Without it, sails could not be managed, cargo could not be secured, and anchors could not be trusted. Coils of hemp line passed through many hands before reaching a ship. So too did sailcloth, pulleys, and spars. To think of Venice at sea is to think not only of captains and merchants, but of all the material. Chapter 4. To outs D. Doutry. Arsenals, oars, and merchant sails. Ashel. Tesa. Pitch and tar gave ships their protective skin. Caulkers pressed fibres into seams and sealed them against the stubborn intrusion of salt water. This was dirty, repetitive labour, but it preserved lives, cargoes, and the city's wider ambitions. A leaking hull could destroy months of investment, so maintenance mattered as much as launching. Venice was sustained by repair as much as Chapter 4. Des also mine. 2. Arsenals, oars and merchant sails. Bosh. Dude. Not every Venetian ship served the same purpose. Light galleys, moved by oar and sail, could travel with speed and manoeuvre well in conflict. Broader merchant vessels carry heavier cargoes and favoured capacity over agility. State needs, commerce, diplomacy and defence all required different designs. The Republic's familiarity with the sea came partly from this variety. Venetian Chapter 4. Tankard. Dupulum. Arsenals, oars and merchant sails. Ter. The galley held a special place in Venetian life. Long and narrow, it combined muscle and wind. Oars mattered when harbours were crowded, currents difficult, or breezes uncertain. Sail mattered on longer stretches, where efficiency and endurance counted. A galley's motion expressed discipline. Many rowers moving together gave the vessel both speed and steadiness. In that Chapter 4, Devil. Deep Grove. Arsenals, oars and merchant sails. TLI. Think Catramangi. Merchant travel was rarely left to chance. Venice developed systems of organised convoy navigation, especially for major trading routes. These state-regulated convoys, known later as Mude, linked commerce to public oversight. Ships often travelled according to schedules, licenses and agreed protections. Such order reduced some dangers of piracy. Chapter 4. Leak. Doubly well. Arsenals, oars and merchant sails. -2. 2. Convoys gave merchants a measure of security, but they also demanded patience. Departures might wait on season, cargo readiness, or official arrangements. Once underway, ships were expected to keep formation as circumstances allowed. Cooperation was not merely admirable, it was practical. A lone vessel offered easy temptation to raiders or hostile patrols. According to Chapter 4, WLET half. 2. Arsenals, oars and merchant sails. Balfour. 30. The sea routes of Venice stretched toward Dalmatia, the Byzantine world, the Levant and beyond. At different times, Venetian merchants reached Alexandria, Constantinople and many intermediate ports. They carried textiles, metals, timber, salt and crafted goods, then returned with spices, silks, dyestuffs, grain and Chapter 4. The 8 now, the 8. Much. Arsenals, oars and merchant sails. The Hakakas. Commerce in Venice was therefore never abstract. It had weight, smell, texture and routine. Bales were counted, barrels rolled, crates marked and customs assessed. Porters strained under loads while scribes recorded quantities and obligations. Warehouses near the waterfront became extensions of the harbour itself. Goods rested only briefly before moving to 4. Venetian Manresas. Lo. Arsenals, oars and merchant sails. Bless. Pasha, night-taken nation soda. The Republic's officials understood that maritime success required administration. Laws addressed shipping, contracts, insurance in later periods, port conduct, and the responsibilities of crews and merchants. Not every rule was obeyed perfectly, of course, but the framework mattered. Venice did not drift into power by accident. It cultivated habits of Chapter 4. Bet. Thectisi. Arsenals, oars, and merchant sails. Taste good. Daily life around the waterfront mixed urgency with familiarity. Boatmen called out, lines were cast, barrels unloaded and small repairs began before larger plans could proceed. Apprentices watched older workers and slowly learned where strength was needed and where balance mattered more. Children growing up near the canals would have seen hulls at every stage of use. Tastes good. Dick. Chapter 4. This. 2. Arsenals, oars and merchant sails. Mott the 8. Ow! Discipline was especially visible where many men had to act as one. On a galley, timing mattered. Oars that failed to keep rhythm wasted strength and upset movement. Orders had to be heard and followed. Supplies had to be managed carefully across days or weeks. In difficult weather, small failures could quickly multiply. So Venetian maritime culture valued training, Chapter 4. No. Belay. Arsenals, oars and merchant sails. Suiel. Taste good. There was also risk in every direction. Storms rose quickly in the Adriatic. Sandbars, reefs and unfamiliar approaches could damage a ship before any enemy appeared. Political rivalry could turn a routine journey into a guarded one. Disease travelled with crews and cargoes. For all its confidence, Venice never mastered the sea completely. It learned instead to live with Chapter 4. Touge, Datig, arsenals, oars and merchant sails. Taste good, the Iction par, the lagoon itself trained Venetian instincts. Its channels, mudflats, shifting depths and narrow passages demanded attention from anyone navigating them. Local knowledge mattered immensely. Pilots and boatmen learned how tide and light altered familiar routes. This intimate education shaped the wider republic. A people raised among such waters became Chapter 4. Dibel par. Topi, arsenals, oars and merchant sails. Dage e Taiskud. Maritime power also influenced how Venice imagined itself. Ceremonies and public language often linked the republic's destiny to the sea. Yet beneath the symbolism remained practical truth. Ships brought food, revenue, communication and protection. Without reliable maritime connections, Venice would have been vulnerable and diminished. The sea offered opportunity, but only because Chapter 4, not cashen. Toot, arsenals, oars and merchant sails. Patch. Dow Pinamake. In quieter moments, one might picture the end of a working day near the arsenal. Light softens on the water. The smell of resin lingers. Tools are set down, but unfinished tasks wait for morning. Half-shaped timbers lie beside completed fittings. Somewhere nearby, a vessel rocks gently against its berth. Such scenes remind us that history is not made only in battles. Chapter 4. HEOH. 2T Axtell. Arsenals, oars, and merchant sails. That's a teak. This is ash. Venetian commerce depended on trust as much as on cargo. Investors trusted captains, merchants trusted records, and families trusted that distant journeys would return with profit enough to justify the risk. None of this trust was simple or complete, yet the system endured because expectations were reinforced by institutions, custom, and experience. Chapter 4. Dopping. That shrow my hall. Arsenals, oars, and merchant sails. Du Asdal. Tap. Over centuries, Venice became famous for splendour, ceremony and wealth, yet all of those rested on humbler foundations. Behind silken stone stood cordage, timber, pitch and labour schedules. Behind diplomacy stood convoy routes and dependable hulls. Behind painted processions stood the daily exertion of anonymous workers. To understand Venice truthfully, we Chapter 4. Daute. Tietsortar e. Arsenals, oars and merchant sails. E. Taste good. So this chapter leaves us not in a Senate chamber, but by the water's edge, where craft met necessity every day. Venice rose through trade and maritime reach, but those achievements were sustained by disciplined making, careful planning, and long familiarity with salt water. In the hush between one tide and the next, we can sense the Republic at work.